Once he was gone, I took a deep breath and looked up at the little green house. It seemed bigger suddenly, and a darker shade of green, though I knew it was more my mind playing tricks on me than anything. Through the window, the silhouette of Abigail Granny Clark shuffled about in her kitchen, occasionally disappearing out of sight around the corner, only to shuffle past in the opposite direction a moment later. I ascended the front porch steps, my right hand sliding into the candy bag to feel the walkie-talkie and make sure it was face up for easy access and only 2 clicks away to the emergency button on the front. My pirate makeup was probably starting to run down my face due to the sudden sweat I built up on my forehead. The stuffed parrot on my shoulder felt like it was getting heavier. Somewhere deep inside me, a little voice was whispering, "I do not want to be here. I do not want to be here." Over and over again. I felt certain I was going to hurl at any second. Come on, time to nut up or shut up," I whispered to nobody. My finger would literally not push the doorbell button. It hovered there in front of it for a solid minute, just trembling in fear. Then the walkie-talkie in my bag squawked once loudly, and I clutched my chest as my heart lurched. Okay, I snarled quietly through gritted teeth at Spencer, who I knew was sending me a signal. I rang the doorbell. The sound of busy work inside the house stopped. I hadn't really been paying attention to the banging and thumping going on inside, but when silence passed over the house, I became horribly aware of the noise that had been going on as I approached. A sliding sound, followed by another thump, then a louder thump. I'm sure you've had this experience if you're reading this. Should I ring the bell again? I thought to myself. Footsteps answered my question soon after. Heavy, slow footsteps coming to the front door. The sound of their approach served to fill my tankard of dread even further. There was a hesitation in them, like Granny Clark wasn't sure what to do, or maybe she was waiting to see if I'd leave. It was, honestly, I could say, like something in a horror movie. Please do not make me ring the bell again. Please don't make me ring the bell again. The porch light came on and I froze. It was like being cast suddenly into a spotlight on Broadway. There I was for all to see. Through the small semicircular window in the door, I caught a brief glimpse of someone looking out to see who had rung the bell. I couldn't make out her eyes, just her eyebrows in darkness, and the door creaked open and I was face to face with Abigail Clark herself. She looked haggard. Her eyes were sunken and hidden in shadow. Her features were even more pale than usual, and her whole face seemed to hang off of her skull. She had pulled a shawl over her head, hiding most of her shock-white hair. I could only see a few strands hanging down in her face. I swallowed the lump burning in my chest. My throat felt so parched suddenly, I could barely squeak out the words. Trick or treat? Granny Clark did not say a word. She just stood there, not moving, staring at me with the dark lumps around her eyes and that sickly-looking face. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement behind her in the kitchen. I knew Spencer had entered the house. I needed to fill the silence or he'd be busted for sure. I coughed loudly, then blinked several times, trying to think of something to say. Miss Clark? I stammered. I'm sorry if I woke you. Oh shit, I said we. My mother insisted I stop by and say hello while I'm out trick-or-treating tonight, and I almost forgot. I knew she'd be disappointed if I went home, and I told her I hadn't paid you a visit, so I was hoping that despite your light being off, you'd... Granny Clark opened the door further immediately, noticing my stammering, obviously, stepping halfway out onto the porch. As she did so, I noted the heavy brown coat she was wearing. I also noticed a thick pair of gloves on her hand. She seemed to straighten and turn, reaching behind the door jamb for what I assumed was a bowl of candy. Are you having trouble with the heat in your house, Mrs. Clark? I could hear myself, and it sounded like I was a 5-year-old about to cry. Why wasn't she speaking? One gloved hand beckoned me closer. Her breathing sounded labored and ragged, every exhalation gurgling like a diver using a snorkel. The expression on her face never changed. No sign of joy or excitement like I had ever seen every time we'd visited her in the past. She seemed like an entirely different woman, and I felt sensations of discomfort and fear battling each other in my gut. I stepped closer, holding my bag out, when a heavy thump came from the back of the house, followed quickly by a clatter of dishes shattering on the floor. Granny Clark and I both stiffened. "Oh, fuck," I thought to myself. Granny Clark turned her head in the direction of the kitchen, where Spencer seemed determined to make as much noise as he possibly fucking could. It sounded like he had started having a seizure back there and was flopping around on the kitchen tiles, slapping everything in sight. Panic lurched out of the pit of my stomach. It felt like my eyes were going to bulge out of their sockets at this very moment as I tried to think of anything to save my ass in this situation. My mind blanked with just the word, "Go!" flashing like a neon sign in the center of my brain. Without another word, I turned away to make a hasty retreat. Granny Clark's heavily gloved hand clamped around my wrist. For being over 100 years old, so they said, she had a grip like a lumberjack. She squeezed so tight, my legs turned to instant jello, dropping me to my knees. My goodie bag hit the ground with a loud clatter as I grabbed her hand, crying out in pain. "Mrs. Clark, you're hurting me!" Her other hand behind the door jamb appeared, holding not a bowl, but a large box cutter. She slid out the blade, looking at me with the same motionless expression, and pulling me closer to her. The whole moment was so surreal. I just knelt there on the porch, and she dragged me towards her, trying to understand what was happening. Why was she holding a box cutter? Where was the candy? What the fuck is going on? It was Spencer who saved me. His voice echoed, once screaming distantly from the kitchen, while almost at the same time crackling over the airwaves and coming out of the bag at my feet. "Run!" Granny Clark turned out and again in the direction of the kitchen as she caught sight of Spencer dashing past, throwing open the back door and disappearing into the backyard. In so doing, her grip loosened on my wrist ever so slightly, just enough for me to twist my arm and squeeze through her fingers. She turned back to me, gasping at me with her free hand while she is holding one of the box cutter arched back threateningly. She arched it back as though to stab me. Even then, laying there on the porch, watching the kindest old woman in town come at me, the blade of the box cutter glinting from the street lights, I tried to rationalize the situation. This was not the Granny Clark I knew. I looked up at her, sobbing in panic and trying to find the words to calm her. "Please!" I scrambled back a foot. It was just a joke. I'm sorry. Honestly, I'm sorry." The left half of Granny Clark's face seemed to sag like it was melting. Her eye looked funny, droopy. The guttural breathing suddenly sounded more like a snarl, feral and angry. She brought the blade down, and I instinctively raised my hands to protect myself like anybody would, screaming in pain as I felt the edge slice through my fabric of my costume and open the flesh of my arm. I did not give her a second chance. My legs, which had surrendered to gravity, felt an intense burning of adrenaline pump through them. Tucking into myself, I rolled backwards, trying to gain my footing, but ended up tumbling on the porch instead. White-hot pain shot up my left side, and I screamed again, but refused to pause. I was too driven by blind panic and adrenaline. I got to my feet in a hurry as the old woman on the porch straightened up, towering me over like a giant. She tromped towards the steps with a frightening determination. Spencer, eyes wide with terror, came around the corner of the house at full tilt. He surveyed the scenario unfolding on the front porch and looked of confusion washed over him for a second before he grabbed me by the arm and spun me around. "Make for the woods!" And with that he was off like a shot, sprinting towards the end of the drive where the forest started. I ran hot on his heels, my arm and my head both throbbing. Dizziness and nausea swept over me, and I tripped over my feet, colliding with the side of Granny Clark's car and pausing for the briefest moments to vomit down the side of it. How had everything gone so wrong? What the fuck? Before I could collect my thoughts, I heard the heavy thud of boots and, looking back, saw Granny Clark's hulking form lurching toward me, silhouetted by street lamps and her heavy coat with the shawl over her head. She looked massive, like a lumbering whore hell, bent on my destruction. Nobody's going to believe this. Even I don't believe it, and I'm seeing it, I thought. I shook it off and bolted for the tree line. I knew I could just make it to Juniper Street. I'd be safe. The trail was a windy quarter-mile, but it was all downhill, and I had enough terror-based energy pumping through my veins to keep me going. I had thought that for years, and Every gnarled root that might trip me up, every change in the angle of the descent, every curl to avoid a tree in the dark. Just get home. The moon was out, and it was filtering through the branches, making beams in the dust kicked by Spencer before me. It highlighted the path and cast the forest in a creepy blue hue. Everything around me seemed to glow. If I hadn't been running for my life, I might have stopped to take it in. The adrenaline coursing through me made time to seem like it was slowing down. Every footfall felt like I was slogging through thick mud. I've never been as perfectly attuned to my senses as I was spinning through the forest that Halloween. I could hear everything around me, my breath coming out slow and focused, my heart thumping through my ears, the snapping of branches further down the path as Spencer, less familiar with the way, ran ahead, and the heavy clumping of someone down the trail behind me. I turned to look at her persistence. I did it, knowing all the stories people were being told not to look back, and all the bad things that happened to them when they did. I did it, of all people, in all situations, not wanting to really see what it was because I knew. I did it, and all my hopes of making it home disappeared in a flurry of wings like a flock of startled pigeons. Granny Clark was right behind me, thundering down the trail like a rampaging elephant. She was a good 20 paces back, but I could see her perfectly in every silver moonlight we both ran through. The most frightening thing about her was the look on her face. It wasn't one of anger or even determination. In fact, there was no expression whatsoever. Still, she had gone full Slenderman. Her eyes were dead. Her mouth seemed to hang open. The left half of her face still slouched down like melting candle wax. And then the wind whipped her shawl off of her face, and her face went with it. It just slid off as easy as a Halloween mask, disappearing somewhere on the trail behind her as she closed in on me. As determined and frightening as ever where her face had been, there was blood, just blood everywhere. But I could finally see her eyes through it all, and they were looking at me with a terrible rage and madness like I had never seen before. I thought I was going insane. She bore down on me, the sight of her hate-filled, bloody face burning forever into my mind. Her hands reached out, trying to grab me and guide me to hell, but all I could focus on was that scarlet face, the true fury within her, finally revealed. There was a sharp turn in the path, and I slowed only for a fraction of a second to make it. Granny Clark was not as familiar with the trail, her momentum driving her straight on. Her fingers licked past the back of my head and wrapped around the stuffed parrot on my shoulder. She tore it off as she barreled headlong into the trees behind me, crashing to a stop with violent abruptness and then silence. She can have the damn parrot, I thought. When I burst out of the woods and onto the tamarack of Juniper Street, I was moving like all of hell was on my heels. Ahead I saw Spencer slowly turning, trying to catch his breath as he reached the driveway to my house. Somewhere along the way he had lost his own trick-or-treat bag, and most of his makeup had run off. "Don't stop!" I screamed at him. He turned, seeing me hurtling down the road like an Olympic sprinter, and hurried up to the front door, banging on it and shouted. I dashed up the front of the sidewalk, shoving him aside and throwing my shoulder into the door. Having enough sense to just turn the knob and open it, we fell over each other on the landing, and Spencer kicked fluidly, trying to close the door behind him. I climbed over him and slammed it shut, then deadbolted it and leaned my full weight against it and broke down in tears while clutching my arm. "Jesus fucking Christ!" Spencer yelled. We both started shouting over each other. Neither one listened to the other until my mom and dad, hearing the commotion, ran from the living room to find us yelling and bloody. They looked over us with mild annoyance until my mom saw my shirt soaked red with blood and her eyes bugged out. "What the hell happened?" She yelled at us. I sobbed, my mind retraced through everything that I had just witnessed. Her face. They took her face. It came right off. Both my parents looked equal parts of concerned and nonplussed. I could tell they thought we had just spooked ourselves and gotten hurt running away. I waved my hands at Spencer to silence him, then told them everything. As my story unfolded, their expressions vacillated between doubt, anger, and concern. Honestly, telling them that Granny Clark attacked me with a knife and then chased me through the woods before her face peeled off, I had a hard time believing in myself. When I finished, Spencer told his side. When I went into the back door, I could see Will and what I thought was Granny Clark at the front door. I tried to creep around to the stairs, but I tripped over a pair of legs. Mrs. Clark's legs.